Good afternoon, my name is Olga Atamanova and I want to thank everybody who joins Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform. It's day 349 of the full-scale invasion, and now we will be talking about the situation in Kherson region. Joining us online is Yurii Sobolevskyi, first deputy head of Kherson Regional Council. Good afternoon, Mr. Yurii. Good afternoon. Mr. Yurii, we know that Kherson region spent no single day with no pause. It's been incessantly shelled by the enemy. What is the situation? What is the aftermath of the latest shelling by the occupiers? Unfortunately, yes, the security situation is quite complicated. Within the last day there was 31 shelling documented, 7 on the city of Kherson itself. Fortunately, we don't have casualties, only 2 injured persons who are now being provided medical aid, and after the stabilization of their condition we will solve the issue with their medical evacuation. The most strikes are inflicted on the medical institutions, educational institutions, residential areas, and obviously the critical infrastructure. However, now everything is being mitigated in a very prompt manner, so the people could receive the basic services, could get water supply, gas supply, power supply, so that our humanitarian support could work in an operative manner. It's our top priority. We work 24/7 to provide the constant access of our people to the medical services, because talking about the city of Kherson itself, the situation is satisfactory here with the medical services. However, in the communities other than Kherson, the situation is more complicated. We get a lot of support from Medics with No Borders. We re-established the operation of ambulance and other medical services. In some communities the hospitals are either destroyed to the ground or they pillaged so bad that we will need more time to fully re-establish the operation of those facilities. Mr. Yurii, if you have this information starting from the moment of the occupation, how many people have become the victims of the shellings, and what's your evaluation of the scale of destruction, of the scale of damage? We have these statistics. Every single case is being documented on a daily basis, and every spot which was hit by the enemy rocket or missile, there is an operation team which documents the type of ammunition used. But for the time being I cannot give you the exact figure as of today, but starting from the moment of the occupation and the beginning of the intense shellings, well, you remember there were no shellings within a day or two after the occupation, but within all this period there was only 1 or 2 days when we had either no casualties or injured. Well, Mr. Yurii, do we understand it right that people just physically don't make it to the shelter because of the proximity of the location of the launching facilities of the enemy weapons which launched the rockets against Kherson? Yes, the enemy uses cannon artillery, MLRS and mortar systems. In some locations the enemy shoots at us right from the tanks. They hit our buildings just using the tank cannons, and it's like the time for reaction is counted in seconds. Unfortunately, the system, the signal system, the alarm cannot work in a timely manner, and if it's a massive strike, the time between the reaction of the alarm and the end of the shelling, it may be just counted in seconds. So our recommendation is just stay out of the open spaces, because the majority of those affected by the strikes, either dead or injured, they were those who were ended up in the open spaces during shellings. But sometimes, unfortunately, the Grad rocket hits the residential building directly, and you just cannot hide from such a situation. As to the critical infrastructure, to what extent are the residents of Kherson are now provided with the electric power supply, with water and heat? Are there any issues in this regards, and if so, what are those problems exactly? Well, talking about Kherson, more than 90% of consumers have access to the electric power, water supply and gas supply. The situation is a little bit more complicated with centralized heating, but again, the majority of consumers have those services now. In some spots we had no possibility to reconnect the water supply, but we connect the generators to reestablish the water supply. In those areas, the situation is more complicated in the communities. Way less people live there, but as to the number of settlements, less than 50% of the settlements are connected to those basic infrastructural services. The works are still in progress to reconnect more settlements to water, power and gas supply. However, the pace of reconstruction is unsatisfactory, because people who live for like half a year without power supply or water supply, well, you can just imagine how difficult it is for them. What are their conditions of their, how difficult are the conditions of their living? But we cannot expedite the pace of reconstruction, because we have limited resource in terms of resources of the companies who do this, but we cannot press on them, given the condition. Well, Mr. Yurii, as to the number of population in the city of Kherson and in the region, and what is the dynamics? Do people leave, or the other way around? Do they keep coming back? Now the number of population is reducing gradually. 69 persons left only within the last day under the program of voluntary evacuation. Those were the people who applied to either military administration or volunteers or the operational headquarters. And I think that it's a very correct decision, because the security situation is very complicated. Well, from humanitarian vantage point, the situation in Kherson is satisfactory. The pharmacies work here, the supermarkets, everything that can cover the basic needs of the population. Obviously, the majority of the businesses are closed due to the security conditions, but in humanitarian terms, the situation is satisfactory. But from the security point of view, the best solution and the best decision is voluntary evacuation until the very moment that the enemy is completely destroyed, completely eliminated in those areas from which they keep shelling our territory using the MLRS, cannon artillery and mortars. So the threat is still there. Well, there is some new information that the residents of Kherson apply to the police that they cannot get in touch with their relatives in Kakhovka region for a very long time, and they say that it's likely that their relatives are forcibly deported to Russia. Can you give us a couple of comments on this situation? Well, unfortunately, that scenario is quite possible, because that clandestine deportation is still going on. The pressure on our people on the left bank of the region of Kherson is immense. The parents are being pressed on, so they get their children to so-called Russian schools. They are threatened to have their children taken away and deported to Russia. There is an absolutely tremendous pressure on the businesses, so they don't use hryvnia, to get hryvnia totally out of circulation and to implement ruble in their settlements. And as to the people living close to the banks of the Dnieper, they are being pressed on, so they evacuate, so to say evacuate, because the Russians want to create so-called dead zone there, because their military units are located there, which use those territories for shellings against Kherson and the regions along the banks of the Dnieper, the right bank of the Dnieper. We have to understand that there is a lot of people living on the left bank who support the armed forces of Ukraine. They hand the information, they send all the information about the location and movement of the enemy troops. So the situation is very complicated. It's very difficult for them. We have questions on the floor. Irina Mamchur, Ukrinform. I would like to continue about the right bank of Kherson region. I have a question in that regard. How is the situation over there? What do you know? For what you know, can you give us a couple of comments? Good afternoon. Thank you for your question. Look, the situation, humanitarian situation, is very difficult there. They bring it closer to the condition that we could call humanitarian catastrophe. They shut down all the medical facilities there. They plan to shut down 7 more hospitals there and to reopen them as the military hospitals. I'm talking about Oleshki, Kakhovka, Nova Kakhovka, and a couple of other settlements in that area. The equipment is either pillaged, either taken away from those hospitals to Novotroitsk or other places. There are still appointments happening there, but in fact no medical aid is provided there. It's just like some doctors stay there. People have to go to Genishevsk to get any real medical aid. Moreover, the Russians press a lot on the businesses who and many businesses just refuse to work using Russian ruble and pay taxes because they can end up in a situation when they will be criminally liable after the deoccupation. So the humanitarian situation is very difficult in those territories. Also, the Russians continue their pressure in all levels, including extensive propaganda and clandestine deportation. When under the psychological pressure, they force our people to leave to Russian Federation and continue living there. They are absolutely not interested in our population, in the Ukrainians, to stay in the Kherson region, in those territories currently controlled by Russia. They understand that they will not get any support from the Ukrainians in those regions. They tried buying their trust. Everybody remembers those money disbursements they were paying all around. They were trying to pay the families to send their children to Russian schools, so they mix pressure with terror and it brings no good result to them. So someone took the decision to deport the people, just to move people, push people away from Kherson region to Russian Federation and to have them disseminated in Russia, and so they assimilate there. Well, I have another question about the shelters in the city of Kherson itself. You already mentioned that people may only have seconds to react for shelling, but again, even for now and for the future, the shelters may save human lives. We understand that no such work could be done when Kherson was occupied, but right after the occupation, do we know about any inspections of or repair works in the shelters? How many Are those shelters enough for the number of people living in Kherson currently, or for the number of people who used to live in Kherson before occupation, and because hopefully people will come back after we liberate more of the Kherson region? What is the condition of the shelters? Are there repair works going on? And are they enough? Is it the number of shelters? Is it enough in general? Well, it's the responsibility of regional military administration and municipal military administration. They were tasked to ensure proper condition of the shelters. However, unfortunately, for the time being, many of them are still in unsatisfactory condition. In parts of them, the repair works are in progress, performed by the military administration, and some of those shelters were in private property of the businesses, and not all of the owners can be reached agreement with. Some of them cannot even be contacted. For what I know, we offer to the municipality, given the nature of the conditions, we should have the shelter in every building. We don't really have time. We cannot let people spend a lot of time to get to the nearest shelter. That's why we offer the heads of the residential building communities to establish the shelters in their buildings. Well, it doesn't fully comply with the requirements of the shelter, but it still can save life during cannon artillery shelling or MLRS shelling. The military administration is about to provide the equipment to such shelters, and there is agreement with the state emergency service in Ukraine. So they inspect the buildings and install the stoves for heating. Besides, in the educational institutions where there are cellars, there are works going on to outfit those cellars as shelters and resilience stations with Starlinks generators, so that everybody knows which is the closest educational institution, which is the closest school. Everybody knows the way to them, so that may be a solution for the people to save their lives in the shelters. But again, I want to emphasize that unfortunately, time for reaction to those threats that threat us now is just counted in seconds, so it may not fully solve the problem. Well, in some cases, the people may not even have enough time to get to the shelter. They have to react immediately, either to take shelter in those concrete structures that we install now around the city, or just lie down, face down, to cover the sense from shrapnel. So this is the only thing that works now for saving lives. Mr. Yurii, thank you very much for finding time to join our broadcast. Dear colleagues, I'm reminding you, joining us was Yurii Sobolevskyi, first deputy head of Kherson Regional Council. Our next briefing is at 13:30. Joining us online will be Serhiy Brachuk, head of public council under Odessa Regional State Administration, and we will talk about the situation with power supply in Odessa region. So bear with us. Trust in our armed forces, and glory to Ukraine.